All right, we are going to kind of pick up where we left off from the last lecture and talk about sort of the growth of states and monarchies from the sort of new monarchs that kind of set the foundations for these later absolutists to rise in power. Um, People like Louis XIV and Peter the Great and Frederick the Great's dad. Um, but one of the things before we get started that I want you to kind of think about as we start through this first slide is I think one of the questions there's two really good questions that could come from this. Is like one, obviously compare and contrast how like politics developed in the 17th century across Europe. So you could talk about like Dutch constitutionalism. You could talk about like the growth of English constitutionalism. So like um, there's sort of like this trend in the early 1600s that like the English monarchs are trying to become absolutists, and the English Parliament largely rejects that. And then, but like in France and in Russia and in Prussia, you're going to see the growth of like early absolutists or absolutists like in Louis XIV's case. Um, but so I think like you could write a really good essay about sort of like analyzing the trends or comparing the trends or contrasting, however that question would go. I also think that they like to ask questions about comparing absolutists to totalitarians. So like, what makes people like Louis the Great or Louis XIV and Peter the Great, these people different, these absolutists different than like totalitarians like a Stalin or a Hitler, Mussolini. And so like, in I guess what you'd want to talk about is like differences in technology with radio and newspapers and growth of national economies, things like that. So like they're but at least think about that, right? So like if you got an SAQ like describe one similarity, identify and describe or explain one similarity between absolutists and totalitarians, like you would be able to write that in one difference and one cause of or one effect of these differences or something like that. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we kind of go through this. All right. Um, let's start here with Louis XIV. Okay, so he's going to reign for a very long time, and I know part of that is because he becomes king when he's 5 years old. But I think even with taking that into account, he's king of France for a considerable length of time, and so that Louis has a really large effect on the development of France, both good and bad. Um, the guy that is going to rule in Louis as his sort of agent, as I put there, as a regent in this early part of Louis' life before he's mature enough to become king himself, is Cardinal Mazarin. I would be able to like compare and contrast Mazarin to Richelieu. They're similar, but Richelieu obviously is the better of the examples because of like his politique decisions during the 30 Years' War and the creation of the intendant system. So, like Reichlu does a better job, but Mazarin is pretty similar. Okay, Mazarin's going to help Louis sort of navigate through the Fronde. Remember, he's going to like Louis is going to have to escape the nobles that and they sort of push him out of Paris, and he's got to spend some nights in the field, and he never forgets that. But Mazarin's also going to be really responsible for, and like Bishop Bossuet, or however you would say that in French, is like this whole, that like Louis' persona as like the Sun King, and Louis' persona as like the light bringer, and like God's chosen like French savior, is I think part of what like Mazarin and this Bishop Bossuet guy is building in Louis. Like Louis really envisioned himself as that. Like he had this famous saying, like you see there in the bottom, like "Le état c'est moi," is like I am the state. All right, and I think like when you look at Louis' policies, like some people will like sort of shorthand Louis' policy as like one king, one law, and one faith. And so like he's going to establish his rule. He's going to create one like common set of laws and king's laws that basically everybody follows what he says, and he's going to re-Catholicize people. And so like the strength of Louis is like very like noteworthy. I think the only thing that we talk about when you sort of qualify Louis's absolutism is that it's really hard for uh, even even though Louis was really interested in making sure that everyone was following his policies in all parts of his state, the ability and infrastructure of that would be needed and the ability to do that, it was just limited by the times and the technology of the time. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, the other thing that Mazarin's going to be replaced by uh, Colbert, when Colbert is really the one that's responsible for like creating this sort of mercantilist policies, and this is noteworthy because obviously this is going to improve the French economy. But remember, as the French economy improves, Louis is going to use this money to build Versailles and strengthen himself, and then he's going to use that money to fight a bunch of wars. So if we look at some of Louis's policies, so I just talked about Louis and religion. He's going to revoke the Edict of Nantes that was passed by Henry IV, which I think is his grandpa, and he's going to issue the Edict of Fontainebleau, which basically said like, hey, there's no religious toleration anymore. Everyone's got to be Catholics. He's also going to try to persecute people that tried to blend Catholicism with Protestantism. These were called Jansenists. And unfortunately for Louis, the effects of this like lack of religious toleration is going to cause a couple 100,000, so a large amount of people, of Protestants, to flee to either England or the Netherlands. So this like Louis's religious policies have a negative effect on French society in the sense that like these people that have the wealth to move were often like very highly skilled and talented and wealthy people that were able to go to England or Netherlands and have an economic impact or societal impact because of their wealth and skills. We've talked a lot about Louis's policy toward the nobles. I don't need to talk a lot about Versailles, I hope. He obviously uses that as a trap. He's also going to increase the power of like local intendants who were essentially responsible for carrying out the king's wishes in each little area. He increased their power to collect taxes and make sure that like people were paying into him. And Louis is also going to do the old trick of like removing nobles from important positions and instead appointing like middle class men that would be loyal to him and would be like rely on him for their political power in place. So they wouldn't, they would be more loyal to him. Now, when we talked about this in class today, is like the whole like Louis spending most of the later part of his life fighting wars to try to expand his power in French territory. And so, and one of the, I guess, the effects that we didn't talk about the 30 Years' War is basically after the 30 Years' War, kings exclusively have professionalized armies. So even like when we talk about like kings having private armies and being able to pay people to essentially be their own like mercenaries, well, after the 30 Years' War, not only are kings going to maintain their own private armies, but they're going to be professionally trained and managed. So that like essentially becomes a full-time job. So that's something to note. And I think one of the things you see here in the yellow with the balance of power politics is that like essentially the reaction to Louis's attempts at expanding French influence and power in Europe is an example of this balance of power politics, which effectively are going to be practiced for, I don't know, the next, I guess you could still say that's in place today. I mean, so like this coalition building in order to like prevent any one country from becoming too strong. I mean, we see that with like Louis XIV and basically everybody teaming up to not let Louis merge the Spanish and French empires in the War of Spanish Succession. But then we also are going to see that with Napoleon. You can see that with like the coalition building, like once Germany unifies and like France and Britain coming together to kind of and understanding that like, hey, this new German country is really strong. So I think like this balance of power politics is going to be a pretty important long-term change as far as international relations go. Obviously, we talked a lot about the Treaty of Utrecht, which is going to end the War of Spanish Succession. Remember, this is really, really important because, it prevents obviously the merger of the Spanish and French empires, which would have had huge impacts. But remember, like Britain's the big winner here. Not only do they prevent France from becoming stronger, but they get control of the slave trade, which is hugely important. All right. Uh, Sort of briefly here, if we talk about absolutism in Russia or in Prussia, remember is you have to be able to compare Louis to, and maybe they would do this in a number of different ways. You can compare Louis or the nobles, I guess, between France and Russia and England and Prussia. So there's a lot of similarities between Ivan and Louis XIV, though. And so when you look at like Peter the Great, he's going to have a real love of French culture. He loves just kind of Western culture in general. He wanted to modernize Russia, so he is going to develop a very powerful army and navy to effectively expand to expand Russian power. He fights the Great Northern War, where he beats the Swedish and gets access to the Baltic, and that's where he creates St. Petersburg. And essentially, like I remember, the St. Petersburg is like a large version of Versailles. So Peter forced noble families in Russia to move to St. Petersburg and build these really elaborate, very beautiful homes at huge costs of their own. And so, like, that's a sense, like, he brings them to his city and, like, basically forces them to do things that put him into debt, and that he can sort of control them and see them and etc. He also controls what they dress. So, like, Peter and Louis both control dress codes. I mean, remember that Peter, basically prevented Russian nobles from dressing in their old Russian garb and made them wear Western clothes. He cut their beards as well. So there is a lot going on there and a lot of similarities between Peter and Louis. Now, Peter is going to also try to encourage the growth of like bureaucracy and like including middle class people in government that would be loyal to Peter and the state instead of like being independently wealthy and less loyal. And they're both going to control the churches in their territory. So like there's hopefully you can draw enough parallels there. So also that's going to kind of happen, and this is a result of the 30 Years' War, is that like Prussia becomes a noteworthy force in German politics. And remember, it starts as Brandenburg, and then it later is going to become Prussia. Is that Frederick William, who's Frederick the Great's father, is going to start to sort of lay the bedrock for Frederick to grow Prussian territory, Prussian power. And like remember, Frederick's whole thing was that he wanted to create like a Sparta of the North, and so he wanted a very like strong militaristic society where everything was like highly disciplined and super efficient. And so like that is essentially like the beginnings of this sort of growth of Prussia that's going to lead all the way up until German unification 200 years later. All right, so we're going to kind of run through the 30 Years' War. I'm not going to labor on this point because this is the DBQ last year, and I think it's less likely that you're going to get an essay question about this. But it's undoubtedly the most important war of the war in the 17th century. We talked a lot about how like this is a result of the failure of the Peace of Augsburg to include Calvinists in that Peace of Augsburg. Sort of, Catholics and Lutherans were okay, Calvinists were not, and Calvinism becomes sort of the dominant, most widespread form of Protestantism in Europe. The other result or cause of this is, remember, the success of the Counter-Reformation cannot be overstated. That the Counter-Reformation was hugely successful in combating the spread of Protestantism. Much of the land that was originally lost in this sort of initial phase of the Reformation is actually going to be regained, and that speaks to the strength of groups like the Jesuits and the Ursulines at sort of creating these sort of mission work where they're going out and basically spreading Catholic doctrine and creating schools to indoctrinate people. Um, and so this 30 Years' War is going to start, remember, with the defenestration of Prague, and they're Protestants that are scared of more Catholic control, and there's kind of that trend. And then the war is going to go through a whole bunch of phases, and like the big thing that you need to know is don't forget Gustavus Adolphus, who is probably the most noteworthy person in the middle of the war, as far as like he revolutionizes the way that armies fight wars. Like one of his biggest military innovations is movable cannons, and so like that seems something small, but it had a big effect. And then obviously like the French decision to be politiques and to help the Protestants instead of help the Catholics is, I think, really important too. But let's sort of talk, and I think if you were to get a question about this, it'd be mostly a causes and effects type thing. The Treaty of Westphalia is what ends the 30 Years' War. It also ends the Catholic Reformation. So basically, a lot of people will say that the 30 Years' War is the last religious war. I mostly agree with that. I think that you need to also recognize that the English Civil War also has important religious implications as well. So I mean, those both happened in the 1640s. So what kind of comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia? Okay, so it ends the Catholic Reformation. It's the renewal of the Peace of Augsburg, but they also add Calvinism as a politically accepted faith. And this is essentially what's going to make sure that Germany or German states are going to remain divided until the 1870s, or really 1860s, when Prussia starts organizing the German states together. And in 1870 it becomes Germany again. Netherlands and Switzerland are going to officially gain their independence. Even though the Dutch had declared their independence for a long time at that point, they only officially become independent with the Treaty of Westphalia. The Pope kind of is removed from being able to have political influence. We've already talked about the last of the religious wars. Germany is going to be physically devastated. We talked a lot about this, remember, when we were talking about the 30 Years' War, is that as much of a third of the population in areas is going to be killed. And remember, like this, the reason that happens is because to some extent, like the 30 Years' War really strongly hints at like the total wars that are going to come in the future, with the civilians being attacked and like war attacking like food stocks and trying to bring war to average people. I think is relevant there. I think that's really all I want to say. Yeah, roll tide. All right, so let's talk. So again, I think that you could get a question like this, where analyze similarities and differences between political developments, between European countries or political developments in European countries during the 17th century or something like that, or like maybe they just would pick two countries, and England and France, or the Dutch and the French, or whatever it was. But essentially what you need to group, like England and Netherlands. So Netherlands has doesn't have to go through this like civil war and doesn't have to go through this long process to get to constitutionalism. The Dutch sort of had semi-constitutionalism throughout this period. So I think there are some differences here, but they're both trending in that same direction. Remember, you can really talk about like this growth of absolutism in England, or at least the push towards absolutism in England with Elizabeth. Is that Elizabeth strengthens the monarchy so much that she is essentially like the reason why when she's removed, like James tries to essentially build off of what she did and tries to like continue that push towards like English absolutism, and then Charles, his son, tries to do the same thing. And so like that's, don't forget that, okay? So like Elizabeth's accomplishments, when we talk about like economic effects, cultural effects, I mean, this Elizabethan age is also like the Shakespearean period. She's going to have religious effects with trying to run this middle ground. But we do see, the emergence of Puritans during her time. And then remember that, like, she is going to be relevant in that sort of, like, downfall of the Spanish Golden Age. All right, so if you look at this, remember, really what we're talking about here is, like, James, Charles, English Civil War happens, they kill Charles. Charles is going to be replaced with Oliver Cromwell, and he's going to run this sort of Puritan government in the middle here. And then there's the Great Restoration, where like the nobles in England get tired of Puritan blue laws, and like that the society was no fun, so they bring Charles II back, and then Charles II and James II largely do what their dad and grandpa did, and so they both get removed. Well, Charles II dies, and then James II is going to be removed because the nobles say, like, hey, we don't want to, like, this is trending towards absolutism again and Catholicism again, we don't like this. And so they basically kick James out, and they invite William and Mary to become king in the Glorious Revolution, as long as they'll sign the Bill of Rights. Okay, so this is a lot. I know if you look at this, but it's essentially what I just told you. Okay, so like James I believes in divine right theory, so he's gonna like basically say, I'm the king and God put me here, so like everything that I say goes. That's obviously going to cause a lot of problems with Parliament. James was also wanted to push Anglicanism back towards Catholicism, and so like there's gonna not only be some issues between Parliament and James over like political power, but there's also going to be some like religious friction here. Now, I think what you should recognize is that this is mostly due to political power, okay? So, like, James and Charles are going to constantly fight with Parliament over money. And remember, that was the thing that Parliament had to basically sign off on any kind of, like, changes in tax law. And so, when James and Charles start fighting more wars and getting more involved in foreign affairs, and Parliament's like, well, look, if we control the money, we also kind of want to say in like what the money is spent on, and so, like that causes even more problems over power. And essentially, what we're doing is continuing to sort of push towards like this English Civil War. All right. Now the English Civil War. Okay, this is really a non-war war. Like I said, there's little actual fighting. There's only 4 battles in this war because Oliver Cromwell and his like new army very sort of easily defeats the English royalists. And so what's going to end up happening is essentially like they're going to put Charles on trial. Well, first he escapes, and then they capture him again, and they put him on trial. Charles doesn't defend himself, so they vote to behead Charles. They kill Charles, and so basically go from there. Puritan society. There's kind of a mistake there. So it should say Puritan society was very boring and bland, and like it outlawed all things that like couldn't play cards, you couldn't gamble. You couldn't drink, you couldn't dance, you couldn't, like all these different things were outlawed under these laws. And so what ends up happening is like nobles are like, hey, I'm really tired of living this boring life. And so this Great Restoration happens where like they invite Charles II to come back, and they like essentially start trending in the direction again. Is like, so we are going to have suspicions about like Charles and James about being Catholics or being pro-Catholic. That there's going to be fight over power, and like James and Charles trying to be too powerful. And so what ends up happening then is like Parliament cuts a deal with William and Mary, which Mary was the English princess. And so what ends up happening is they're like, hey, William and Mary, do you guys want to be king and queen? Uh, and they're like, sure. And then Parliament's like, well, we'll only allow you to be king and queen as long as you sign the English Bill of Rights. So um, they say, okay, cool, like we just want to be king and queen. And so under this English Bill of Rights, Parliament has a whole bunch of, like, and English citizens in general get a whole bunch of rights. Okay, so Parliament alone imposes taxes. Laws can only be made with consent of Parliament. Like the standing army is going to be maintained with consent of Parliament. People have the right to petition. People have the right to bear arms. People have the right to free speech, due process. Basically, like you can't just be held without consent. Um, England. All right. And so this Bill of Rights is a major step forward. And you see the little note here in the left. Um, like this is a big step. And like moving towards civil rights and individual liberties and all that kind of fun stuff and democracy. But I mean, we're still talking about a very small number of people that actually participate in government. Okay. Um, all right. And I mentioned John Locke too. So Locke has seen all this happen, and this is part of why Locke writes. Like Locke, when he writes politically, is going to compare like French absolutism and the failures of French absolutism and Louis's wars in the 1690s and early 1700s to like the strength of the English system. So, to some extent, like Locke is influenced by what he sees around him. All right, so we talk about the Dutch. Okay, again, like the Dutch and the English are like the two counterexamples to the growth of absolutism. So like the politics in the 1600s are, um, they're not all trending in the same direction. Like all countries are not doing the same thing, and it's important to recognize that. Uh, they're politically independent after winning their freedom from Philip II in the late 1500s, even though they're technically, like I said, their independence is not formally recognized until the Treaty of Westphalia, but by that point they had essentially been independent for a long time. The Dutch are going to be ruled essentially as like an oligarch, so like an oligarchy, like basically the people that had money and wealth like made the decisions and ruled. There's not really any centralized power, and that can be a good thing in the short term, that like there's no sort of centralizing force to like even grow into absolutism. But that becomes a problem later on, because then like there's no sort of strong central government that can protect the Dutch from outside influences. They're going to be Calvinists, but they're going to be Calvinists in like the predestination and wealth mean that God has chosen you type Calvinists, and they're going to kind of not buy into the like whole like subjugation of women and like intolerance of people that are different type John Calvin stuff, right? So like they pick and choose essentially with their Calvinism, because the Dutch are going to be well known to be very religiously tolerant. They're going to be very culturally tolerant. They're going to be very intellectually tolerant. Like, I mean, this helps. Like we talked about, like the connections between like the Dutch tolerance of like religious and scientific experimentation with like the growth of the scientific revolution. And this is essentially like we're talking about the Dutch Golden Age here, obviously. And so like that openness and tolerance becomes a big attraction to people. The Dutch are going to become the leading commercial power in the 1600s, and also like the leading financial center. Like the Amsterdam and the Bank of Amsterdam is going to be the place where everyone puts their money until at some point in the 1700s, like the London is going to replace Amsterdam as sort of like the financial center of the world. But the Dutch have their sort of long run of wealth. Mostly that has to do with just like the ridiculous amount of wealth that the Dutch East India Company brings into the Netherlands. Remember, I mean, there's arguments you could be made that like the Dutch East India Company is the largest corporation that ever existed. And because of the wealth that flows in, because of all that trade that the Dutch control all over the world, The Dutch are going to have the highest average wages of anywhere in Europe. So like Dutch society had the largest sort of like middle class of anywhere in Europe at that time. Um, and because of that, what's interesting is like this Dutch Golden Age is not just like an economic and societal thing, it's also like a cultural thing. So like these middle class men are not going to be, they're going to be more wealthy than your average person in any other country, but they're not going to be like ridiculously wealthy. And so like the art that they start to have painted for them are going to be things like Vermeer that we'll see here, like where like you have just like these lot of just like everyday scenes. And I wonder if I have one here. I don't. But like there's a whole bunch of paintings from the Dutch Golden Age where it's like, hey, like this is a view of Delft or like some Dutch like harbor. And so like Dutch artists like turned to these merchants who had made their wealth in trade and in map making, or trade or exploration and whatever, and were interested in the world and wanted to show their culture. And so like I think like when you look at like Vermeer and you see the map in the background, like that has certain connotations. You can look at Rembrandt's like examples of like Dr. Tulp's anatomy lessons, and again this would be examples of the scientific revolution taking off in the Netherlands. You look at even like the way that like the Dutch were unique, because again it shows like their Calvinism. So like they weren't, and I mean I guess like we'll tie this back all the way to the Protestant Reformation. Is remember one of the reactions of the Protestant Reformation was that like God, the whole like what is it, the golden bowl or whatever, that like where like they in the Bible they get chastised for worshiping idols, and like the Reformation leaders who read the Bible took that seriously, that like, hey, like worshiping art and architecture is wrong. And so like part of the Protestantism is like just being extraordinarily plain, and you can see that in their dress. And the Dutch kind of took that. It was like they're early capitalists. They wanted to use capital, they wanted to use money to make money. All right, that's the whole like tulip mania thing. And then again, like with Vermeer, you have the astronomer here, where he's got charts and globes and all this kind of fun stuff that show like the interests of Dutch people and the worldliness of them. And then remember, we talked a lot about like the girl with the pearl earring, and how like even though this is a very simple painting, it shows a lot of like the cultural effects of different areas with like the headscarf and the makeup and I mean, even though like we've said like they weren't actually pearls, but like the like having pearl earrings with that, like that would be that large, would have been extraordinarily costly. So I mean I think this is a high probability question. So like you should know Vermeer's paintings. So girl with the pearl earring, or like just understand that like Vermeer is going to paint. And then, like this is the easy thing, I guess, on if you got a question like this on AP test day, is like Vermeer, like you can say one that's like the map maker, the astronomer, like these are all things that like he's going to paint, and then obviously Rembrandt. Okay, so last thing about the Dutch Golden Age. So the reason the Dutch Golden Age ends, essentially two reasons. One, the Dutch have to fight a series of Dutch Anglo Wars. So that was during, what am I trying to say? During the Puritan stage of British government, they're going to basically fight a bunch of wars against the Dutch, and then during the wars of Louis XIV, the Dutch are going to have to take a big brunt of like Louis's expansionism, being that they shared a border with France at that time. So, like basically fighting the wars with the British and the Dutch in the late 1600s and then early 1700s. Is going to largely explain like why the Dutch like Golden Age kind of fades away. All right, that's all I got today, folks.